When the Nintendo 64 was released in 1996, it was arguably the first modern console by Nintendo. It was specifically created to compete against the PlayStation and Saturn by Sony and Sega. So Nintendo knew that the console had to not only be familiar to serious gamers, but also appeal to casual gamers as well. This very specific balance of familiarity with experience was something that made the console remarkable. The unique aspect even extended to accessories related to the console. But the speculative scenario is this: the Nintendo 64 controller was ahead of its time, and still is. In early 2020, a Japanese cosplayer took a series of photographs of herself with video game related accessories. Thinking it to be casual yet suggestive, internet attention from across Japan and the United States took notice instead of the particular controller that she posed with. The discussions were about how she sat with the controller and even held onto the controller in her hands. Those with a clear eye noticed that she was holding it wrong. Her pictures caused so much interest that when later interview, she mentioned that the system was released before she was even born. Therefore, she didn't have any real idea on how to hold it properly, and just assumed that random placements of her hands onto the controller was acceptable. The incident later brought about discussions with how to properly hold the controller, and that there was a generational difference between gamers of those who were old enough to remember the era of the Ultra 64 and gamers who were too young to now comprehend that time. From information now known, Nintendo 64 was released during a time in video gaming history which is now considered to be an in-between phase from a graphics or processing point in time where the transition from two-dimensional to three-dimensional games were occurring. For reference, prior to the 64's release, the said gaming transition had controllers with a horizontal grip. Both hands were placed onto either side of the controller. Buttons for input were placed into the right side of the controller, while the directional part was placed into the left side of the controller. The origins of the placement with direction and buttons were standardized in the 1980s, but by the mid-1990s, Sony had put out the analog stick for the PlayStation. As mentioned, this era in video gaming history was an in-between period, so with the PlayStation's games, some of them used the new stick technology while others did not. Developers were voluntary with the implementation for the use of the stick in games, but Nintendo mandated developers to use the analog stick for Nintendo 64 games. As when the console launched, games had optional settings for players to use a directional pad with the stick, also a loophole to sidestep Nintendo's requirement for the analog feature. Complaints with the controller from the time had it that there were different grips to use, all depending on the said game in theory, and all depending on the mode of play that the gamer had to use the particular controller with. So the hand could be placed on the left side to handle the directional pad, and on the right side to handle the buttons, or the left side for the directional pad and the right side for the analog stick, or the left side for the analog stick and the right side for the buttons. The entire hand placement combinations that could have been implemented for any sort of Nintendo 64 game made the controller technically difficult to use. As a result of confusion or awkwardness to properly handle, most games of the Ultra 64 console later defaulted to the left and right grip, with the analog middle grip on stick seldomly used, unlike the more effective PlayStation dual stick combination. The rear port were for external and optional accessories specifically for the controller. While Nintendo believed that most developers would utilize the particular port, it was almost never used. The lack of use underscored the original potential of the rear port, which even had technical applications for a screen that would shift some of the aspects with play away from the console itself onto the screen. None of this technology was patented by Nintendo, and it's now theorized that it was modified and engineered into the Dreamcast's VMU. The version of the controller that Nintendo ultimately produced for the console was actually a design that wasn't exactly favored by all within the company. Details of the controller were different, and the prototype of the controller had particular features with the joystick stick, but the details for the stick were actually simplified in the final version of the controller when in comparison to the earlier prototype. The prototype's analog stick was of a larger thumb resting grip, which would have made it easier to use in a circular way or to pivot on even held in a neutral position. The pivotal detail of the prototype stick was that it would be able to be moved in a full 360-degree range of motion. The actual Nintendo 64 controller did not do such. The actual controller moves from an octagonal-based opening in the controller. It's been speculated that the reason for this octagon design was that it was the transitional era, and it was believed that this could have helped gamers adjust to the three-dimensional scope of modern gaming. From the years on decades since the release of the console, opinions later held that the controller was ahead of its time. The controller was so ahead of its time, features of it were rarely utilized or even understood by developers or gamers since.